home for our youth, even as they come of age. The future is theirs to decide, and by creating multi-generational community, we can make sure they won't forget who they are and where they come from. We can give them roots to match their wings. These children are not just the future of Third Unitarian Church. They are its heirs. They are the bearers of its heritage, and they will carry the flame and welcome the next generation of pink-haired moms into their hearts.
Each week we have an opportunity to share our resources with one another and in that way declare our values. Resources are a tangible expression of our energy in the world, and by sharing them with this church, we say that it matters to us. We give not because we're obligated to, but because through our giving, this community offers us meaning and support. We give not because it makes church possible, but because the church makes all of us being together possible. This morning's offering will be gratefully received. May it be joyfully given. Will the ushers please come forward? People say, this is all together. People say, what is the sense of our small effort? They cannot see that we must lay one brick at a time, take one step at a time. A pebble cast into a pond causes ripples that spread in all directions. Each one of our thoughts, words, and deeds is like that. No one has a right to sit down and feel hopeless. There's too much work to do. Will you join us in sermon hymn number 168, One More Step?
One
So last Wednesday, the Chicago Area Liberal Ministers Racial Justice Group met here at Third Unitarian. We've been working together since Ferguson, developing a shared theology of racial justice, gathering racial justice learning tools for ministers and for congregations, and creating a medium-range action plan for the Chicago UU ministers. During our meeting, one of us offhandedly wondered what we would do if what is happening now in Baltimore unfolded in Chicago next week. We sort of raised our eyebrows and looked around at each other, nodding very seriously and thoughtfully, and kept on with our meeting. But as the conversation continued, the question slowly sank in. What had been sort of thrown out rhetorically became a serious question. It's not impossible to imagine. Are we ready for that? What will we do if that happened? When I was a child, I got in a very large fight with my father when he shared a family recipe with the neighbors. My childhood friend had eaten the dish at our house and told her parents how much she liked it, and they asked my dad for the recipe and he gave it to them. When my dad passed that recipe on, I felt a very big sense of loss for a small child. I felt like there was very little that was special about my family. We were just like everybody else. And that recipe was one of the few things that felt distinct to me, so I clung to it like a sense of identity. When my dad gave it away, it felt like he was giving away a piece of who we were and what made us special as a family. It took me decades to realize that even though I am a member of the dominant culture in the United States, that dominant culture is still a culture. I've inherited culture from my family of origin that is distinct, like that recipe, but I've also inherited the dominant culture itself. But that culture is still culture. It just seems less like culture to me because I'm immersed in it. The fish struggles to witness the water. But there are awareness practices, both individually and communally, that can bring our attention to that thing in which we are immersed. Attending to your breath, for instance, can help you notice the air. You might notice a breeze, or that the air is full of soot, or that there's humidity. You might notice more easily shifts in what you're used to. But with practice and attention, you can begin to notice even the thing that you are very used to. People most commonly notice their culture by either not being in it anymore, read going to China, or having a friend who is a member of a different subculture and visiting their family, or by having your culture bump up against a different culture. So I noticed my own culture for the first time when I moved to New York City for college. It was funny for a bunch of 18-year-old kids from all around the country to bond with one another by laughing at the ways that we differently pronounce words or differently named things. My favorite story was learning that ATMs have different names when you are not in Wisconsin anymore. So in Wisconsin, the most common ATM company is called Time, T-Y-M-E. And we always used that as a stand-in for ATM, the way people often call tissue Kleenex. So when I moved to New York, I discovered that this was a locally specific term when I was looking to withdraw cash and began walking up to strangers on the street and asking them if they knew where their nearest time machine was. It took a few tries of receiving some very weird reactions in order to figure out that New Yorkers call those machines ATMs. So that's the obvious stuff. That's the stuff that's above the surface of the water of culture. Like an iceberg, the majority of our culture lies below the surface. About 10% of an iceberg is above the surface of the water, and 90% of it is below the surface. In the iceberg metaphor for culture, the tip of the iceberg, the visible stuff, are the things that we notice easily. Food, folks, fun. So music. Music is above the waterline. Do we want jazz, or do we want pop music played at the surface? Do we want music from the 50s or the 20s or the 90s played in the surface? Food. Food's above the waterline. Where will we go as a community for our ethnic dining experience? Festivals are above the waterline. Festa Italiana or Festival de la Delicia. Language is above the waterline. Is it an ATM or is it a time machine? How do we feel about Ebonics? Do we sing in Spanish? But it's the culture that's below the waterline that's more difficult to recognize, and therefore, that is the stuff that is most likely to sink the ship. Or the friendship. Thanks, I was really proud of that pun. The culture underneath the waterline includes things like a sense of time, physical distance, emotional range and expression, ways of being sacred, modes of communication, expressions of hospitality, decibel level, manners, facial expressions, approaches to conflict, conceptions of cleanliness, decision-making processes, body language, understandings of community, the importance of the individual. The list goes on and on. There's a banking commercial that came out a few years ago that illustrated just how these below the surface understandings of how we do things can really sink the ship. In the commercial, a British banker is visiting some clients in China, and they're having dinner together. And at the dinner, his Chinese hosts have served him a very special dish, eel. And helpfully, the eel is brought out to the British man live before they serve it to him. And it's sort of swimming around in the water, very snake-like, and he gets to look at it. When it comes out, dead and cooked, it still looks very much like a snake. And the Brit looks at it queasily, but then eats the entire thing to show his appreciation for the food and the hospitality of his hosts. When he finishes it, slurping down the last bite, everyone else at the table looks at him incredulously. And the leader of his Chinese hosts immediately snaps and orders another eel. A second eel comes out, even bigger than the first, swimming around in the water. And the Brit looks at it like, oh my God, I have to eat that one too. And it comes out and he eats another eel. Completely, barely swallows it, and looks around at a sea of shocked faces. Again, the leader of his host snaps his fingers and orders a third eel, even bigger than the last. Again, the Brit eats the entire thing and looks at a sea of shocked faces. At the end of the commercial, we learn that in Britain, one shows appreciation for a host's food by eating all of it. It was so delicious, thank you so much. In China, one shows appreciation for a host's generosity by leaving some food in the bowl to show that one is full and has been satisfied with the generous giving. So some very well-intentioned people ended up running into each other's cultural expectations. The Brit kept trying to show his appreciation by continuing to eat all of the eel. And his Chinese hosts kept showing, we're so generous, by continuing to provide him with more eel. framework of cultural competency recognizes that navigating cross-cultural relationships is a skill that can be learned. Step one of learning this skill is recognizing, first of all, that culture exists. For many people, particularly those who are members of a dominant culture, but also anyone who hasn't spent a lot of time in another culture, there is work to be done around being able to recognize the specific elements of one's own culture. So culture is just the way we do things around here. How many of us have either heard or said, it's just the way we do things around here? Anybody? I have. That's culture. Culture can be generational, it can be place-based, it can be ethnic, it can be racial, it can be national. Within a larger culture, there are often many subcultures. When I came to Third Unitarian, for instance, I spent some time learning the way you do things around here. Sometimes that was easy. I had people come up and talk to me about the story for all ages, or highlight for me which songs you sing and which ones you do not. Other times I had to run into the iceberg in order to figure out what was going on. When I was planning out services for the year, for instance, I didn't know that there are Sundays when Third expects there to be a guest preacher. Martin Luther King Day, the Sunday we celebrate Black History Month, the Sunday we celebrate Women's History Month. I discovered the expectation after having already booked my guest preachers for the year, and there was a bit of a worship budget snafu. It's not the worst thing in the world, but it's something that you discover when you suddenly have a new minister who doesn't know the way that you do things around here. Culture, like tradition, isn't a value-neutral concept. Now, I would sound a note of caution against judging someone else's culture if you haven't been situated in it for a long time. It's complicated, particularly when there's a power differential involved. So when the dominant culture places it in a position of judging the traditions of a less powerful subgroup, it's important to ask the question, why? Why is that particular piece of the subgroup's culture being brought forth for examination or criticism, and why is it being brought forth at that particular moment in time? So the culture of white supremacy, for instance, has consistently used the narrative of saving brown women from brown men during moments of imperialism, colonialism, and white supremacy. Now that doesn't mean that we have to take a values lens off when we're engaging in those kinds of conversations. It's completely reasonable and appropriate to disagree with sexism. But it's helpful to be aware of why all of a sudden the mainstream media is suddenly terribly concerned about the well-being of Iraqi women when they were not particularly concerned about those same women's well-being during the US-backed sanctions of Iraq. So why is one narrative being brought forth at one particular time? We have to ask ourselves that when we're looking at a culture that we're not a member of, and be aware of our own power and position in relationship to that culture, our own prejudices, our own intentions. And we have to work to have some level of humility when engaging in that dialogue. It's easier to judge the value of traditions within our own culture. Sometimes the way we do things around here aids our work for justice, and sometimes it aids privilege and power. And sometimes it's just neutral. Here at Third, for instance, and in a lot of Unitarian Universalist congregations, the cultural expectation is to ask people to rise in either body or spirit, or rise as you are willing and or able. When I first came here, I was not saying that. I was just saying rise. Apparently, a few people were concerned about this issue. And eventually one of my worship associates, approached me to have a conversation about it and explained that the reasoning behind that is about accessibility and inclusivity concerns, Asking folks to rise in body or in spirit includes an invitation to everyone, regardless of physical ability. It's a cultural element of this congregation that broadens the spirit of church to include more people. So this was a positive value that I shared, and I adapted. I began saying rise in body or spirit immediately. It's now part of the way I do things around here.